Well, here with me to review them are the journalists Varashni Pillai and Professor of Law and Politics at Temple University in Philadelphia, Susan Sullivan. Thanks so much to both of you for joining us. Let's start with the unrest in Philadelphia after the police shooting of another black man, Walter Wallace Jr. I mean, we're back here again, tragically. Sue, you're in Philadelphia. Just give us a sense of how people, what's been the reaction and how people are feeling there?
Well, I think the reaction is, as anticipated, somber. But there is a sense that, yes, this is part of the bigger conversation to say that these protests are dramatically different, precisely because they're happening here in Philadelphia. These are young African-American males who historically do not vote. And Pennsylvania is one of 5 American states out of 50 that really is in play. Both Donald Trump and Joe Biden need to win the votes in Pennsylvania. So how they respond to these protests is going to have a critical difference, because if they can galvanize this group that historically does not vote to go out and vote on their behalf, because this is happening in Pennsylvania, because it's happening now, how they respond could actually be the driving force in what happens in Pennsylvania and indeed in the entire election.
It's interesting, Varashni, isn't it? President Trump has called the looters in Pennsylvania Biden supporting radicals. Again, he's sort of focusing on the violence rather than the grievances of the anti-racism demonstrators.
Absolutely, and this is incredibly dangerous. I mean, we're a few days away from one of the most, if not the most divisive elections in US history, an election where multiple polls have shown that there are real fears of unrest and tension and a mass non-acceptance of the results. On both sides of the divide, there is real suspicion that these elections will be fixed. For Trump as the leader in this time to focus, as you have said, on the violence, on whooping up some more of that divisive rhetoric is incredibly dangerous. It shouldn't be a surprise, but it is, and it's devastating given the background of a man who was mentally ill, who was killed in front of his family by police. It's a horrible, horrible way to lead a situation.
Sue, is there a fear that the unrest will continue in the lead up and then even beyond the elections?
I think there is. I think Americans don't know what to do. They've never experienced this, so they're bracing for something that they've never experienced. I mean, mainline media, mainstream media are publishing articles. The New Yorker last week published an article, what can you do if Trump stages a coup? I mean, this is unheard of. So some people are expecting, guns in the streets. Some people are expecting just protests. So we're all somewhat guarded and nervous about what's going to happen on the 3rd.
OK, well, turning to another upsetting story, more migrant deaths. Latest, a family with young children attempting to cross the British Channel from France to the UK. They certainly won't be the last to try. Charities like Save the Children are saying these deaths should be a wake-up call to those in power. Varashni, what more needs to be done, do you think, to prevent tragedies like this?
Well, of course, we are living in a globalized world where we're going to be seeing more and more of these crises happening in various countries. And I think a true measure and test of a country's strength and leadership is in how it treats the most vulnerable people arriving on its shores. Now, unfortunately, in the UK, you have seen a hardening of attitudes towards refugee seekers and asylum seekers. And, it's a little bit ironic that Home Secretary Priti Patel said that she was sorry to hear of the tragic loss. I mean, of course, I don't doubt that she is sorry, but the policies under her have become increasingly strict towards undesirable migrants, undesirable asylum seekers. And I think that speaks poorly of the direction a particular country takes. We know that migrants everywhere and asylum seekers everywhere have made up some of the world's most cosmopolitan, diverse and strong populations and workforces. And these kind of policies we've seen spring up across the world that is anti these kind of people entering borders and making it very hard for them to do so, to the point where they're risking their lives, is horrible for everyone concerned.
I mean, Sue, there have been calls to crack down on the people smuggling gangs. There are also calls to create legal routes for refugees to reach the UK. Are these possible solutions, do you think?
I think they are possible solutions, and I think these calls for these solutions are important. But I think there is another level here, and that I think compounds the tragedy. And I think this is a wake-up call, as this article says, because we've all seen the body of the toddlers who wash up on the beaches. We hear this tragic story now about these deaths in the Channel. But next week, this is last week's news. The public's attention drifts. So I think we need to figure out where we really stand on these issues. And they're complex. They have far-reaching economic, political, social, moral implications. But we need to find out exactly where we stand on this. And then we have to really hold the government's feet to the flames, because it's not just about making calls for the government. It's about really standing behind those calls and making them a priority.
So is it that the asylum system is breaking down somewhere? And if so, where? Varashni?
It's really hard to tell, but we do know that in the current kind of turmoil we're seeing in international relations across the world, that the kind of unity between the developed countries, the stronger countries who would normally come together around these kind of issues is breaking down, with the leadership role that the US once played in these international roles really breaking down, the US itself vacating that position of leading these kind of things. So we're seeing a real clawing back or falling apart of a strategic, holistic response to global crises, and a lot of resources being withdrawn through a time of also a global depression economically that lots of countries are facing, where more and more resources are being taken away from these kind of efforts.
OK, moving on. Comic Relief, the fundraiser that has raised £1.5 billion for communities in Africa, says it will stop sending white celebrities to African countries. And that follows criticism that its promotional films are reinforcing white saviour stereotypes. Varashni, you're in South Africa. You must see this sort of stereotyping every day. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, quite honestly, I'm a bit surprised it took them this long. I think on the back, the decision comes on the back of a lot of criticism that they've been facing, not just recently, but for years. I mean, there's an award called the Radiate Awards, right, that came out of a viral video that happened in 2012 already. This is 8 years ago. And in the video, it was called Africans for Norway, send radiators to Europe. They're dying of cold. And it was a parody of how Africans are viewed by those in developed countries, in the developed world, in the Western world, and how, it was very simplistic, the idea of African children with flies on their face. These narratives are harmful. They're not harmful only because they impair the dignity of those they are showing. They're harmful in the very efforts of the organizations behind this. They've been doing this for 50 years, since Bob Geldof in the 60s and Band Aid. If they keep showing the same images, they're going to hit donor fatigue. People are going to feel like, what's changing in Africa? Nothing's changing. We keep giving money and nothing happens, because we're talking billions of pounds here, right? That gets raised through organizations like this, over £1 billion in its 35 years. So it's just not that interesting. It's just not that creative, and it doesn't achieve the results. So it's about time that they change their tactic, because there are so many better ways of doing what they're doing, which is worthy work. But you don't need to center the white celebrity as the central motif and person bringing this money and this care to Africa. There's other ways to do it. There's a more keeping with modern depictions of what Africa is.
Sue, you're nodding over there. I mean, obviously, you're in agreement that this is a time for change. It comes off the back of the Black Lives Movement and lots of protests about sort of recognition of that. Do you think that this is a time that is ripe for change?
Oh, I think I agree. It's well overdue. And I think we live in a world now we can see what's happening. So, we need to ban the role of behavior and kind of appealing to people's pity, and change the narrative and start looking at what local cultures are doing, which not only empowers the locals to get involved and to have their voices heard, but also is educational. So we're not just appealing to people's pity and the general, having a two-way conversation, which is well overdue. So it's really, I think this is a great movement in the right direction.
All right, and then just lastly, as Australian scientists have discovered a detached section of the Great Barrier Reef that's bigger than the Empire State Building. Some good news coming out of that side of the world. Finding a new half-a-kilometre tall reef. I guess it just shows how mysterious the world under the sea is, Sue.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this just goes to show how little we know about our own planet, and how much more is out there that we don't know about. So, but it also need to listen to the scientists who are telling us what we need to do to preserve what we do know that we have. As the temperature of the ocean keeps rising, we're going to lose what we already know we have at an alarming rate. So, yeah, I think this is beautiful. I still haven't been scuba diving. I would like to, that's on my bucket list. And now we just know there's more coral that we can explore, which is a very positive, encouraging thing.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned sort of global warming, and that's been, in recent years, vastly damaged the Great Barrier Reef by warmer seas, which have killed off much of the coral. Scientists say the reef has lost more than half since 1995 due to warmer seas. Varashni, do you think that's been driven by climate change?
Well, I don't think there's any argument or scientific proof against it. I think the climate change debate has firmly landed in the scientists' favor, that man-made, that human-made, rather, efforts have driven the rising climate, the rising temperatures across the world. And we are facing a crisis here. There is a reason that students and young people are leading this movement, this change, because I feel like the rest of us have become quite numb to it, quite kind of silent on this issue. The last time I was on the show, I was with Sue as well, talking about the Great Barrier Reef. And I mentioned then that Australia is seeing this happening on its doorstep. And yet, under the government of Scott Morris, there has been reneging on the Paris Deal agreements, or even real reluctance to implement their obligations on that. And this is across the world. We're seeing governments being really reluctant to commit to the Paris Agreement, which is vital to keeping climate change within a viable bandwidth and prevent further loss of life, including our own.
Thank you so much to both of my guests, Varashni Pillay, Professor of Law and Politics, Susan Sullivan. It's been great to chat to you both. And Susan, make sure you do tick off that scuba diving on off your bucket list. Thanks to you both.
Thank you so much, Lena.